On an ordinary morning, just like any other in Willow Creek, a cozy town nestled right there in Oregon, Mr. Arthur Peterson walked through the shiny glass doors of the Liberty Bank. He carried the quiet weight of his 80-something years, the lines on his face telling stories that, let's be honest, few people bother to hear these days. And his hands, though a little shaky, still showed the strength and grit of decades of hard work. Arthur wasn't a show-off, didn't have a lot of fancy stuff. His clothes, modest but perfectly clean, a flannel shirt, its cuffs a bit worn but clearly cared for, and his well-pressed jeans. On his head, that faded navy blue baseball cap, an old friend from countless construction sites. On it, the words, "Nation Builder," were almost gone, but they were still there. He wore it not out of vanity, but as a quiet reminder of a whole life spent serving. In his light jacket pocket, besides a wallet with hardly any cash, were two things that meant the world to him: an old ID badge from an engineering company long out of business, and a small metal piece, almost octagonal, with this intricate design, a majestic eagle in flight, flanked by 7 stars. A subtle thing, really. But to anyone who knew his real background, it was a badge of deep, deep respect. Arthur was there for one simple, humble reason: he just needed to pull a few $100 from a savings account he honestly hadn't touched in over 40 years. It was a little nest egg he'd built with the sweat of his youth, the last bits of hazard pay from infrastructure projects that had taken him to the remotest parts of the country, building dams in the wilds of Montana, bridges over roaring rivers in Alaska. These were vital projects that shaped America, but they were often forgotten once the dust settled. All he wanted was a quick, quiet transaction. No fuss. Inside the Liberty Bank, that cool air conditioning and the constant hum of machines felt miles away from the gentle warmth of the Oregon morning outside. The line, pretty average for a Friday in mid-June, moved with that familiar, slow bank pace. Arthur, leaning lightly on his cane, watched people come and go. He had a kind of patience, you know, the kind forged from years of waiting for supplies on distant job sites and dealing with government paperwork. It was a patience that very few young folks in that bank seemed to have. When his turn finally came, he walked up to the counter. The teller, a young woman in her early 20s named Ashley, gave him a standard, practiced smile. But as she typed Arthur Peterson and the account number, that smile just melted away into a confused frown. She blinked, then furrowed her brow, staring at the screen with this mix of disbelief and real uncertainty. "Mr. Peterson, this account, well, it's been inactive for a very, very long time," she stammered, her voice betraying a mix of surprise and awkwardness. Arthur, feeling the slight tension in the air, held out his driver's license. "Yes, young lady. It's an old one. I just wanted to take out some funds. Everything should be in order, I believe." That slight tremor in his hands, barely noticeable, wasn't from fear or weakness. No, it was from the lingering ache of old rheumatic pains and those freezing nights he'd spent sleeping under tarps on nameless construction sites. Ashley typed again, the clicking of the keys echoing in the silence between them. Suddenly, she stopped, her eyes glued to an error message or alert on the screen. Something just didn't fit the expected mold for a regular Liberty Bank customer. With a sigh, she called for her supervisor. "Brandon," she called, a little louder than she probably intended. "Can you help me here, please? This customer has a really old account." Brandon, the branch manager, a man in his early 30s with a crisp pinstripe suit, a trendy haircut, and a smile that seemed more like a pose than a genuine expression, walked over. He leaned slightly over the counter, his gaze not even bothering with Arthur's documents. Instead, he just sized up Arthur himself, from head to toe. In his world, everything was about sales targets, reports, and premium client profiles. An old man in a baseball cap and a worn shirt just didn't fit that picture. Brandon picked up Arthur's documents, his nose wrinkling just a tiny bit. "Arthur Peterson, is it?" "Sir, these documents, they look like they came straight out of a history archive," he scoffed, drawing out the word, sir, in a way that made it sound less like respect and more like an insult. Ashley, the teller, let out a nervous little giggle, trying to cover it, but the sound still reached Arthur's ears. Arthur didn't reply right away. He simply reached into his coat pocket, his movements slow and deliberate, and pulled out that small metal piece he treasured so much. He placed it carefully on the counter. It was that bronze coin, with the majestic eagle and the 7 stars etched into it. To anyone from his generation of engineers and major project builders, that item spoke volumes. It was a silent symbol of a brotherhood. Brandon barely even glanced at it. "Oh, a cute little trinket," he mumbled, completely uninterested. "Anyone can just buy those things online these days." His voice dripped with disdain, and he didn't even bother to examine it. "I think we've got another wannabe trying to game the system here," he said, turning to the bank's security guard, a burly but kind-faced man. "Please, escort him out." The guard hesitated for just a second, his eyes scanning Arthur, maybe sensing something wasn't quite right. But Brandon's authority in the office was undeniable. Some customers watching from a distance, hiding behind their phones, let out muffled chuckles. Others just pretended not to notice, hurrying about their own business. Arthur, though, didn't react with anger or make demands. His dignity remained completely unshaken. He simply picked up his coin, slid it back into his coat pocket with the same care he'd taken it out, nodded once, and walked slowly but steadily to a wooden bench near the big window. From there, he could see Willow Creek's main street and the park trees across the way. He sat upright, his hands calmly folded over his cane, his eyes fixed on some distant point, as if he were looking at landscapes from a time long, long ago. The laughter in the bank slowly died. A strange, heavy silence began to settle over the lobby. It wasn't the silence of guilt yet, no. It was a cold, persistent discomfort. Deep down, people seemed unsure, as if the scene they just watched held a deeper meaning than they first realized. One person, though, didn't laugh. Her name was Maya Rodriguez, a woman in her early 30s with dark hair and intelligent eyes. She used to be a logistics specialist for a major infrastructure construction company, and now she worked as a consultant. Her eyes had been drawn to that coin Arthur placed on the counter. She'd actually seen an identical item once before, in a meeting with a renowned retired chief engineer, a true legend in her field. She remembered the deep, visceral respect with which every engineer in that room had stood up when he placed that very coin on the conference table. For Maya, Brandon's outright contempt for that object felt like a personal insult. Maya walked directly to the counter, locking eyes with Brandon, who still had that arrogant look, and said in a calm but conviction-filled voice, "You just made a big mistake." Brandon blinked, clearly surprised. "Excuse me?" Maya pointed her chin toward Arthur, sitting on the window bench. "That man is no fake. That coin alone outranks every paycheck in this building." Brandon snorted, his face reddening. "If he's so important, why isn't anyone here with him? Why doesn't he have armored cars and security?" Maya didn't answer. She just stepped outside and made a call, her voice low and urgent. But someone else had already noticed. In the back of the bank, in the dim light of an old, dusty office, an older employee, one of those quiet, lifers, who had no grand title but knew all the institution's history, had overheard the name Arthur Peterson. His name. He paused what he was doing, a sudden jolt of electricity running through him. Slowly, he walked to a corner of the room where a bronze plaque shone faintly on the wall. It had been there since the bank opened, a solemn dedication to the founders and builders of Willow Creek and, more specifically, to those who built its very first infrastructure. Among the engraved names, one that never faded, even after decades, was A. Peterson. This was the man who had overseen the conception and construction of the first water networks, the access roads, and the foundational structures that allowed for the urban and economic development of this very area where the bank now stood. The same man now being accused of fraud in the institution that literally stood upon the legacy of his command. The veteran employee, affectionately known among the old-timers as Old Man Fitz, didn't say a word. He picked up the phone, dialed a number only a handful of people knew by heart, a direct, high-level contact. In a low voice, charged with an unusual urgency, he uttered just 5 words, almost like a code, "It's Fitz. Peterson is here. At liberty." Then, he hung up. Outside, Arthur remained still as a statue, embodying patience. He didn't pull out his phone, didn't make any move that could be seen as a protest or an appeal. He just watched the wind gently tug at the American flag in the park across the street, his eyes fixed on the everyday tapestry of life. And he waited. He wasn't waiting for immediate justice, or for applause, or even for recognition. He waited because that's just what men like him had always done. They wait until they're needed, they wait even when no one believes them, they wait while the world ignores or laughs at them. But what no one in that bank knew, not Brandon, not Ashley, not even Maya, was that in about 30 minutes, that laughter and apathy would turn into absolute silence. Because, just a few miles away, a furious chief engineer, a living legend in his field, had already slammed his phone onto a desk, thrown on his work jacket, and was on his way to make sure the man everyone dismissed, the man they called a fake, would never, ever be overlooked again. The next 20 minutes inside the Liberty Bank of Willow Creek just dragged on like molasses, slow, thick, and incredibly uncomfortable, especially for those who had been laughing moments before. Ashley, the teller who had scoffed, now kept her head down, pretending to type furiously on her keyboard, avoiding any eye contact. Brandon, the manager, paced back and forth behind the counter, his face tight, throwing anxious glances toward the front doors, clearly agitated, though he still didn't know why he felt so nervous. Arthur Peterson didn't move an inch. He stayed exactly where they'd told him to sit, as if this were just another waiting room in another government building, just another day in a long life of lines and cold stares. His hands, aged and a bit wrinkled, rested calmly on the handle of his cane. His shoulders, though obviously tired, held a remarkable posture, a leftover from decades of discipline, despite a chronic ache he never told anyone about. And that coin, that small metal piece, the symbol of his honor and his legacy, stayed tucked away in his pocket, its presence as invisible to most people there as the massive scope of his service to the nation. But the silence around him was different now. It wasn't the silence of contempt or indifference anymore. No. It was the silence of doubt, of a tension you could almost feel. A customer near the coffee station, who had earlier shared amused glances with someone else about the "old guy," suddenly grabbed her purse and hurried out, without making her deposit, a vague look of unease on her face. A security guard named Tom, who'd been watching the scene with a bored air, now stood near the exit, shifting his weight from foot to foot, uncomfortable, casting quick glances at the old man who hadn't made a single fuss, hadn't raised his voice once, or even looked angry. Yet, Arthur seemed to radiate a presence that just unnerved people used to authority and superficiality. Brandon tried, and failed, to shake off the growing discomfort. "He's still here, seriously," he muttered to Ashley, peeking over the counter. "He's probably just hoping someone posts about it so he can get a pity donation online. These builders always try to cash in." Maya's jaw clenched tight, and young Ashley lowered her gaze, avoiding Brandon's eyes. Even she, with all her inexperience, knew this had gone too far. Brandon leaned back on the counter, with a self-satisfied look. "I should have just called the cops. It's only a matter of time before he causes a scene and goes viral." But, just as Brandon's last words left his lips, the bank's glass doors swung open with a force that just demanded attention. It wasn't a gust of wind, or a regular customer walking in. No, it was a command. A chill sliced through the room from outside. Boots. Real boots, polished leather, hit the marble floor with precise clicks. There was no rush, no hesitation. Just a deliberate stride. And then, he walked in. Dr. Everett Kane, in his formal uniform, absolutely perfect, every metal gleaming, every line of fabric pressed razor sharp. His presence was so overwhelming it filled the entire lobby before he even said a single word. Behind him, an aide followed, a briefcase in one hand, solemn and silent. No one moved. The ambient noise died instantly. Phones were put away, coffee cups were left mid-pour, and Brandon, still leaning on the counter, looked up, then froze. His smug smile just collapsed into shocked silence. Kane didn't acknowledge anyone at first. His eyes, piercing and focused, locked directly onto the bench by the window where Arthur Peterson still sat, calm and dignified. And then, in front of the entire bank, Dr. Kane snapped to attention. And, with a precise, almost reverent motion, he saluted. The sound of that gesture, the crisp smack of palm against temple, resonating in the stunned silence of the bank, was louder and more meaningful than any apology or explanation ever could be. Arthur looked up, confused for just a moment, before slowly rising, his body responding to a call he hadn't heard in decades. With the dignity of someone who hadn't been saluted in years, but who never, not for an instant, forgot how to return it, he raised his hand and returned the salute. Then, Kane turned slowly and scanned the room like a sharp blade. His voice, when he spoke, was low, but sharp enough to cut glass. "Who here called engineer Arthur Peterson a fraud?" he asked, every single syllable carved from steel, the question hanging there like a condemnation. No one answered, not at first. The silence was deafening. Kane stepped forward, his presence commanding. "Engineer Peterson," he said again, emphasizing the title with chilling clarity, was instrumental in setting up civil engineering and construction protocols that are still the foundation of many of our modern projects nationwide. His record covers the design and oversight of 6 major regional projects and 14 often undocumented but crucial infrastructure operations. He turned his eyes, now burning, to Brandon. "You questioned his identity? You mocked his age?" Everyone's eyes turned to Brandon, who looked like he might actually throw up. I didn't know," he stammered, his face pale and sweaty. "His documents were old and of course they're old," Kane retorted, his voice rising a notch, but still controlled. "Because he earned his age. He built roads, bridges, and cities for this country while your biggest challenge was figuring out how to schedule automated social media posts or how to sell a product you didn't even understand." The silence in the room shifted again, from plain embarrassment to a deep, collective shame. Kane's aide stepped forward, opening the briefcase. Inside, a thick folder marked "Classified," a commemorative coin identical to Arthur's, nestled in velvet, and a printed scan of the very plaque on the bank wall, with Arthur J. Peterson's name engraved in bold, next to dates that went back to the town's founding. Kane placed the folder on the counter, pushing it gently toward Brandon. "This bank, sir, exists because of his strategic design and the infrastructure he helped build. That account you flagged as suspicious? It funded the original supply lines and initial investments you now profit from and use as collateral." He then turned to Arthur, his voice softening, filled with genuine respect. "Sir, I'm truly sorry I didn't know you were in town sooner. I would have come to receive you personally." Arthur gave a tired nod, a faint smile forming on his lips. "Didn't come to be found, young man. Just needed enough to help my grandson with college." Kane nodded slowly. "Then let's make that happen, engineer." And together, the old builder and the renowned chief engineer stepped toward the counter as Brandon just backed away, hands raised in a silent gesture of surrender. The laughter had vanished long ago. The lesson was just beginning. The silent legacy and the new plaque in Willow Creek. The silence inside the Liberty Bank of Willow Creek wasn't just awkward or tense anymore, it was reverent. Every single person in that lobby, from customers to staff, had just witnessed something fundamental change. It was as if the very ground beneath their feet, the building structure around them, suddenly remembered the weight and meaning of the history that literally held it up. Dr. Everett Kane, the very embodiment of authority and respect, stood beside engineer Arthur Peterson at the counter. He wasn't there to bark orders, wasn't there to demand punishment for Brandon. He was simply present, firm and unwavering, as if nothing else in the world mattered until this dignified man got what he came for. Arthur, with his usual quiet way, withdrew the funds from his account. No ceremony, no grand display. The money, he quietly explained to Dr. Kane when asked, was for his grandson's college, a detail he hadn't even mentioned until the engineer inquired. Arthur never sought attention. For him, service was its own reward. All he ever wanted was to keep his word to those he worked for, to the country he helped build, and to those he came home to. Ashley's hands, the teller's, visibly trembled as she printed the receipt. In an almost unheard whisper, she mumbled an apology. Arthur didn't acknowledge it, not out of spite or resentment, but because he simply didn't need it. The apology didn't matter anymore, his dignity had been fully restored. He took the slip, folded it once, and tucked it into his pocket as if it were just another routine task completed. But as Arthur turned to leave, Dr. Kane stopped him with a firm, respectful hand on his shoulder. "Engineer, you've got 5 minutes," Kane said, his eyes gleaming with contained emotion. Arthur raised an eyebrow. "For what, young man?" Kane didn't answer with words. Instead, he subtly nodded his head toward the vast bank lobby. "For the honor you never asked for," he said, his voice a little thick with emotion. And then, without a single word of command, without anyone needing to be told what to do, something extraordinary happened. Every individual in the room who had served in some capacity on major civil infrastructure projects, every veteran of engineering and construction, from a young engineer by the ATM to an old foreman filling out a deposit slip, they all stood up. They rose and, one by one, with gestures of profound respect, they broke from their stillness to salute Arthur Peterson. Even civilians who had no direct connection to Arthur's work rose from their seats. Not because they were told to, but because something in the air, an electric current of recognition and admiration, told them, this is how you honor a man like that. Arthur, the old builder, froze for a second. It wasn't pride that filled his face, but a deep, deep disbelief. He was used to being forgotten, not revered. Then, slowly, with the same precision and dignity as his original salute to Dr. Kane, he returned the collective salute with a quiet, precise motion. Kane, watching the scene with misty eyes, reached into his coat pocket and handed Arthur a small, elegant, dark velvet box. "We've been holding this for you for many years," he said, his voice a little hoarse with emotion. "Thought you'd want to have it now." Inside the box lay a medal, clean and polished, that seemed to shine with its own light. There were no complex insignias, just a name engraved, Arthur J. Peterson, and below it, 3 powerful words, service beyond record. Arthur stared at it for a long time. No tears, no grand speeches. Just a slow, almost imperceptible nod, as if he had finally closed a door no one else had known was still open. A door to a past of unseen sacrifices, of uncelebrated honors. He then looked at Kane, their eyes meeting, and said softly, "I didn't come here to be remembered, young man. I came to keep a promise." Kane nodded back, and in doing so, "Engineer, you reminded us all what service, true service, really means." Arthur Peterson walked out into the sunlight then, leaving the Liberty Bank of Willow Creek. No cameras followed him, no headlines exploded in the local papers. But the people inside, those who witnessed it, spoke a little softer, walked a little straighter. Later that week, a new line was added to the bronze plaque by the bank's main entrance. Beneath the original dedication to the founders and builders of Willow Creek, a second inscription appeared, in subtle but deeply meaningful letters. Arthur J. Peterson, Chief Engineer, Honor and Silence. It didn't mention the incident. It didn't mention Dr. Kane's dramatic arrival. But everyone who worked there knew. Because some truths don't need to be shouted to change everything. And now, every time a customer walks through those doors, they see the name of the man they almost laughed out of the building, an eternal reminder that true value and true honor often reside in those whose contributions remain, for a very long time, in the shadows, silently upholding the world.